Thank you for the warm reception. Oh, wait, there was no reception. I am Mr. Tallman, and it's a little nerve-wracking getting up and giving a speech, but when I look out at this crowd, it totally relaxes me. Would have been even better if it was Ninja Day, because I've always dreamed of giving a speech to a crowd full of ninjas. Maybe next year. If you don't know me yet, as I said, I am Mr. Tallman. That's tall man, short man, just like it sounds. I know it's an ironic name, considering my stature, as some of you have made clear to point out to me. Just in case I forgot, thank you. I appreciate that. It was even more ironic in grade school, where all the way through 8th grade, I was the shortest kid in my class. Now, in the future, if anybody tells you to go see Tall Man, leave Mr. Huss alone. They're talking about me. Try not to be so literal in the future. If I haven't met you yet, please come say hello. I'd love to get to know each and every one of you. Here's a little background about myself. I'm originally from South Bend, Indiana, just down the road. And the last 2 years, I was living in Krakow, Poland, working on my master's degree. About 4.5 months ago, I married my wife, Lenka Zahradkova. I'll say that again, Lenka Zahradkova, or Lenka Tallman, now Mrs. Tallman, in her home country in Prague, Czech Republic. She finally arrived on Friday and is somewhere, the lights are in my eyes, somewhere back there in the corner, I think. I think that's her. So welcome, Mrs. Tallman. Next semester, I might have some of you as pupils in my comparative politics or government courses, so I'm very much looking forward to that. Now, I've already used most of my really inspiring motivational speeches for the girls' soccer team, so I'm going to have to be really original this morning, and it's a tough act to follow all of the great speeches we heard in the previous weeks. We heard speeches on community, character, worship and reflection, failure, fear, and living with yourself after crashing into a bike rack at Wake Forest. Miss Bihar. That's going to be a tough act to follow as well. Being the last of the new teachers, the previous speakers covered a very wide range of topics. So I've decided to speak on something a little less ambitious, something a little more simple, the meaning of life. Well, let me qualify that. More specifically, what I believe is the most important component to finding meaning in life: attitude. Now, this is going to follow closely what Mr. Kuntz spoke about several weeks back in regards to suffering, perseverance, and hope. In my opinion, the secret to the meaning of life is rooted in how we respond to things that happen to us. The attitude message was present in all the previous talks, and attitude becomes most important when things don't go our way. Attitude defined by Mr. Webster. That's a dictionary. A mental position with regard to a fact or a state, a feeling or emotion toward a fact or a state. Let me simplify that. Attitude defined by Mr. Tallman. How a person responds when things don't go their way. How do you respond when things don't go your way? One of the best-selling poets of all time, Khalil Gibran, said, "Your living is determined not so much by what life brings to you as by the attitude you bring to life. Not so much by what happens to you as by the way your mind looks at what happens to you." Let me say that again. Your living is determined not so much by what life brings to you as by the attitude you bring to life. That's such a critical point. It's not what happens to you. It's how you respond to what happens to you. Attitude is a great word. We hear it all the time. Fix your attitude. How's your attitude? You've got an attitude problem. Bad attitude, positive attitude, etc., etc., etc. Well, I want to tell you a story. Hopefully this gives you a little different perspective. We'll see if this doesn't bring meaning and value back to the word. As I mentioned, the last 2 years I was living in Krakow, Poland, a beautiful little European city that was once a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Cobbled streets, cozy cafes, and magnificent architecture. Yet just 45 minutes down the road is a much smaller little town, a place that now lives in infamy, that will remain forever associated with suffering and death. The Polish call it Oswiecim. The Germans call it Auschwitz. If you don't yet know what Auschwitz is, if the name doesn't ring a bell, I'll give you a briefer. It was the site chosen by Heinrich Himmler, head of the Nazi SS, to implement the final solution, or literally the absolute annihilation of the Jewish people. If you've ever been to Auschwitz, you will notice upon arrival at the base camp, Auschwitz I, a phrase in German that hangs above the entrance gate that reads, Arbeit macht frei. That translates to English as, work will make you free. But for the majority of prisoners arriving at the camp, there would be no work. Death by gas chamber was awaiting them. For women, children, and the elderly, chances of survival were slim, because they typically only selected men for camp labor. And for these men, the daily routine was to wake up by bugle call at 3 a.m. Imagine waking up at 3 a.m. to be marched around in the dark, in the cold morning hours, all the while being punched and kicked, or made to squat or stand in painful stress positions for long durations. These brutal exercises would usually last for 4 hours, so that by 7 a.m. every day, at least 5 or 6 prisoners would be dead. That was Auschwitz. That was hell on earth. A few years after I first visited Auschwitz back in 2002, I was listening to a lecture by a religious philosopher. And at some point in his message, he mentioned a book called Man's Search for Meaning, written by the late Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. I was living in Prague at the time and immediately ran out to one of the few English bookstores to see if they had a copy. To my surprise, they had a used copy there for a few Czech crowns. I went back to my apartment and I read it in one sitting. In this little book, you will get a crash course in perspective. After reading it, I realized that all those things that were such big deals, they were not really big deals at all. I received a massive dose of context. Think you're having a bad day? Feeling sorry for yourself? In a bad mood? Feel like you can't catch a break? That's all normal. Those are normal feelings. We're all going to have those moments. But let me tell you a little bit about what Dr. Frankl went through, as written down in Man's Search for Meaning, because I think it is the ultimate example of how one's attitude can lead to true meaning. Part of Frankl's understanding of meaning and attitude is rooted in the suffering and horror that he experienced as a concentration camp survivor at Auschwitz and later Dachau. Before the Second World War, Frankl was living and working in Vienna, Austria. In March of 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria, and it became a part of Hitler's Third Reich. In the ensuing years, some 65,000 Austrian Jews would be murdered in Nazi concentration camps. Yet against all odds, Dr. Frankl managed to survive. Frankl describes the sequence of events that unfolded and the typical psychological phases that occurred as a concentration camp prisoner. The train ride, 80 people per coach, packed so tightly that they could hardly move. No bathroom breaks on a journey that would take several days and nights. And they all expected to be taken to a forced labor camp. Yet they were shocked and horrified at seeing the sign when the train finally pulled into the destination, Auschwitz. A word by 1944 that they were all familiar with. And once the train stopped, the doors were opened with a bang, and orders were screamed out by fellow prisoners already at the camp, who were employed to beat them with clubs and send them to various lines. At the beginning of each line stood an SS Nazi officer who would casually point to the left, point to the right, the gas chamber, or slave labor. And if selected for slave labor, one 5-ounce piece of bread would be your only food for 4 days. Then the freezing nights, the rats that would torment them while they tried to rest their weary minds and bodies, this all became a part of their reality. Frankl goes on and talks about the despair the prisoners felt when they were stripped of whatever meager possessions they had left, which for most folks was a memento, a keepsake, something to remind them of the life they hoped to live again one day. Dr. Frankl clung to a manuscript in his pocket. His life's work, all his hard-earned psychiatric research. He writes of the moment it was confiscated, "I struck out my whole former life." One of his passions in life, parts of the puzzle he dedicated his life dissolving, would in a flash be lost forever, while an SS guard laughed cruelly at his despair. So how can one find meaning in the midst of so much terror? How did the prisoners typically respond? Well, despite all the hopelessness that surrounded him, Dr. Frankl resisted the temptation to, and I quote, run into the wire, which was the phrase used to describe grabbing the electric fence surrounding the perimeter of the camp so as to commit suicide, a popular way for prisoners to escape from their suffering. Yet despite seeing friends beaten, tortured, and killed, despite starvation, freezing nights, frostbitten toes from working in the snow, frequent blows from the end of a rifle butt, despite the impossible odds of survival, Dr. Frankl pressed on, indomitable in his will to survive, resolute in his will to live. And on the first night, he made a promise to himself that he would never run into the wire. He made a promise to himself that he would not lose hope, that he would not give up. How would you respond? From where did he derive his strength of will? From where did he find the perseverance to outlast the most terrible living nightmare in human history? I can tell you the answer is found in attitude. Frankl recounts one of the defining moments in his imprisonment, when that horrible bugle woke the prisoners from their sleep at 3 a.m. And for another 4-hour marching session, they would walk around in the freezing cold. The regular beatings were inflicted on those who were too weary to march in step, when the man next to him whispered into Victor's ear, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us." The impact this had on him was incredible. I'll let him describe it, and I quote, "For the first time in my life, I saw truth as it is set out in song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth, that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. I understood how a man who has nothing else in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring sufferings in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries for his beloved, achieve fulfillment." Wow. That's an attitude. Whatever it is that I'm currently suffering with, it comes nowhere near the physical and mental torment that engulfed Dr. Frankl in 1944. His attitude made it possible for him to persevere, but not merely to survive. He was actually able to taste the joy and the love he had for his wife. But he had to have the right attitude in order to receive those gifts. In the camp, Frankl identified a major difference in the prisoners who died and those who survived. The man who responded to camp life believing that there was no meaning in life, no purpose, no aim, was lost. Those prisoners did not live very long. Under those conditions, it was vital that they changed their attitudes to life. That they had to find a way to respond positively to the circumstances. Instead of asking, what is the meaning of life? They had to answer all the questions that life asked of them. And they had to respond, as he writes, in right conduct and right action. I can remember being a high schooler, believe it or not. I can remember the ups and downs. There are moments when you're going to feel like the world's against you. You're going to have those bad days. And the answer to the meaning of life will reveal itself in how you respond to those difficult situations. But in order to respond in right conduct and right action, you got to have the right attitude. So as I wrap this up, I want to try to encourage you. Well, I'll be more honest. I want to try to guilt you into reading Man's Search for Meaning. And as the great Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, speaking to a group of university graduates, said in regards to Dostoevsky's epic novel, Brothers Karamazov, I want to say the same thing about Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. There are 3 types of people in this world: those who will never read Man's Search for Meaning, those who might read Man's Search for Meaning, and those who have read Man's Search for Meaning. So I hope that all of you will take the time to read this important little book, and that it has as profound an impact on you as it did on me. I'll leave you with a quote from Dr. Frankl and hope that you really take it to heart and think about your attitude and ask yourself whether you typically respond in right conduct and right action. And I quote, "Forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except for one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in life, but you can always control what you will feel about what happens to you." Thank you.